I heard an American preacher in Belfast, after a flowery introduction by the chairman, he said, "I don't really appreciate that, but I do deserve it from the bottom of my heart." I said to someone recently, the Lord is a great boss. He provides for all your needs. The only thing is he doesn't have a retirement scheme. And the person I said it to said, "David, you're wrong. He's got a wonderful retirement scheme. In fact," he said, "it's out of this world." Well, now the theme of the Feast of Tabernacles this year is Spirit of Grace and Supplication. But I'm allergic to texts that are taken out of context and used as mottos. So the first thing I did when I heard that was the theme was to look at the context. And I'm sure you've heard of the little cliche, a text out of context is a pretext. And so I'm going to give you 2 Bible studies tonight and tomorrow night in the context of that phrase. Others will speak about the phrase, but I'm going to speak about its context. Years ago, my wife and I had a son, and at 6 o'clock on a Sunday night, I said to my wife, "Please, get on with it, because the tax year ends tonight at midnight." And bless her, she got on with it, and he was born at 9:15 on that Sunday evening, just less than 3 hours later. So we had to call him Richard Wesley, because John Wesley was born again at 9:15 on a Sunday evening. And so what else could we call him? Because John Wesley is a great hero of mine. Last night on television, we watched a program about the house in which he was born. It's in Epworth in Lincolnshire. It's the old rectory. And when he was just 7, it was burnt to the ground. And all the family escaped, but nobody had remembered little John. And suddenly they saw him at an upstairs window, the little boy. And there was no ladder. So what did they do? The villagers formed a human pyramid and got up to the window and saved little John. And if they hadn't done that, 750,000 people in England would not have been saved. Such little things. And when his mother, who was a real Bible lover, Susanna Wesley, received the little boy, she said, "A brand plucked from the burning." And she was quoting a prophet, Zechariah, from which this very theme for this year has been taken. And Zechariah as a prophet is full of quotable quotes. For example, here are some he said about Israel. He said, "Israel is the apple of God's eye." I wonder if you understand that. It's not a Cox's orange pippin or a golden delicious in the hand. It's in your eye. If you look in the mirror, you'll see there's an apple in your eye, viewed from the stalk end. The iris of the eye is the apple of the eye. And it's the most sensitive part of your body. If even a little bit of dust touches the apple of your eye, the eyelid will slam down to protect this delicate organ in your body. And that is why God is called repeatedly in the Old Testament the keeper of Israel. It's a mistranslation. The Hebrew word is eyelid. God is the eyelid of Israel. And you touch Israel, and you're touching the most sensitive part of God. And he is the keeper, the eyelid of Israel, and will slam down to protect his people. Does that give you a new insight into that phrase? And then there's another phrase in Zechariah, not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, says the Lord. But do you know what that's about? It's about the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem by a man called Zerubbabel. And he was told, you won't achieve this by your own strength or by military or political power. You'll achieve it by the Spirit of God. That's the context. Contexts are interesting. It is Zechariah who says that one day 10 men will seize the robes of one Jew and say, we'll go with you, because we've heard that God is with you. And then there's a lovely phrase about Israel. God calls them prisoners of hope. Isn't that a phrase? Prisoners of hope. Can't get away from it. You're imprisoned in hope. And you're stuck with hope. You're chained to hope for the rest of your life. What a lovely phrase. There are references in Zechariah to the Messiah. For example, in one place he's called my servant the branch. And that's a title that Isaiah and Jeremiah both give the Messiah. He is the branch from the root of Jesse. Another one says that he will come as the Prince of Peace riding on a foal of a donkey. And every Christmas, not Christmas, Palm Sunday, we think of that prediction of Zechariah. There is one little phrase, very interesting. It's, his dominion will extend from sea to sea. And that is why Canada is called the Dominion of Canada, because it stretches from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And there must have been some godly folk at the beginning who opened the country up, who said, we're going to call it the Dominion. This extends from sea to sea, and it's the only country in the world that's called the Dominion of Canada. And then there's a terrible verse towards the end where 30 pieces of silver are thrown into the house of the Lord. And you know what that reminds you of, Judas Iscariot. Well, it's a wonderful book, and I've enjoyed reading it, but I'm going to teach you the last 3 chapters, 12 to 14, because it's in that section packed with unfulfilled prophecies regarding Israel. And I confess I have never heard even Christian Zionists expound these chapters. Isn't that amazing? Well, you're going to hear them tonight, maybe for the first time. And we're going to put that phrase, spirit of grace and supplication, back into its context where it belongs, and see the amazing predictions that surround it for the people of God we call Israel. Now here's a question. What do people do with the unfulfilled prophecies concerning Israel in the Old Testament? Many have been fulfilled. I don't know if you realize what an incredible book this is for predictions. There are altogether 735 different predictions or prophecies in this book. Some of them come many times, but 735 different predictions. Now I'm going to tell you how many of those have been fulfilled, literally to the letter. And the number is 596. That's 81% of the predictions in our Bible have already happened, literally to the letter. It doesn't take much faith to believe that the rest will happen as well. We know that. It's in the book. God has said it, it will happen. But that's not how many of our fellow Christians think of the unfulfilled prophecies. There are 4 different ways of handling them that Bible scholars have been talking about. The first we call the historical fulfillment, meaning that is the theory that all of them were fulfilled with the exile in Babylon and the return to the promised land from Babylon. And people who believe that say there is no future return. It's already happened in the past. We don't need to look for another. They're rather overlooking the fact that Zechariah was written after they got back from Babylon and still talks about the future of Israel. And Isaiah talks about them returning a second time. And there are many other answers we could give to the people who say these predictions about Israel have all been fulfilled in the past. There's nothing left for the future. That's one answer of the scholars. The second answer is that they were all conditional. And therefore, since Israel has blown it by rejecting the Messiah, they've forfeited the right to claim these predictions. And therefore, they're all been cancelled. God doesn't cancel things. He keeps his promises. The third thing the scholars do to get rid of these predictions is to treat them all as metaphorical, as spiritual, and apply them to the church. But they have to twist them to apply them to the church. And that's why they ignore most of them, because they can't be applied to the church. We're left with the fourth alternative, and that is to treat them as future promises that will literally come true, like all the others did. Now, chapters 12 to 14 of Zechariah are packed with predictions about Israel's future. I want at this point to show you something that will help you to understand how we're going to deal with them. I've got here a jigsaw. And I love doing jigsaws, but did you know it's one of the favorite hobbies in Israel? I only found that out this year, but they love doing jigsaws. And I love doing them too. I guess I must have some Jewish blood in me. But when you open a jigsaw box and look at all the puzzle, all the pieces, you think, how on earth will I ever get all those together? And the answer is you get them together because of the picture on the lid. Now, Hebrews 1, chapter 1 says that God spoke to the older people in the Old Testament through the prophets in bits and pieces. Isn't that an interesting phrase? And that's what you find in the Old Testament. You find bits and pieces scattered all over the place. It's when you turn to the New Testament that you see the picture on the lid. And looking back, you can see how all the Old Testament bits and pieces fit together. Because God has at last spoken to us in his Son and put the whole thing together in Jesus Christ, both in his first and second coming. All the prophecies that remain to be fulfilled in Scripture will be fulfilled either in his first or his second coming. And in fact, in Acts chapter 3, Peter says that when he comes back from heaven, all that the prophets have spoken will happen. And that's why some of them haven't happened. But it means this: Israel has a future. And therefore the unfulfilled prophecies of Zechariah 12 to 14 will all come true. When? When Jesus gets back. And in fact, it actually says that. Now, sometimes when you open a jigsaw, You find some pieces stuck together. Are you like me, relieved? And you carefully pick them out, and you've got part of the picture. Well, there's a little part of Zechariah 12 to 14 that is quite different from all the other parts in those chapters, mainly because it is in poetry. And I hope you have a Bible that indicates by the way the print is organized which parts are poetry and which parts are prose. 12 to 14 is all in prose except 3 verses in chapter 13, which are a poem. They're a misfit. When you first read them, you feel they shouldn't be there. What are they doing? Why are they pushed in among all the prose? The big difference between prose and poetry is that prose appeals to your mind, but poetry to the heart. Poetry is very emotional, and many of the prophecies are in poetry in the Bible. But let's read those 3 verses in poetry in chapter 13. Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who is close to me, declares the Lord Almighty. Strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. And I will turn my hand against the little ones. In the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 will be struck down and perish, yet 1/3 will be left in it. This third I will bring into the fire. I will refine them like silver and test them like gold. They will call on my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is our God. Now, it doesn't sound like poetry there, but the print looks like poetry. It's in short lines and spaces. I want to begin with this poem, because in a sense it's the key to everything else in these 3 chapters. In these 3 verses, we have 3 phases of Israel's existence over at least 2,000 years. When we come to the prose and look at the rest, we will see 10 phases of Jerusalem in just one day. But the background is 3 phases of Israel's existence over the last 2,000 years, and maybe a little more. Well, now you've got an outline in front of you, and I've given titles to the 3 verses. I've called the first, a forsaken flock. I've called the second, a terrible toll, and the third, a restored relationship. Now let's just look at those 3 phases of Israel's history. Notice that a shepherd is struck, and that word means struck fatally, killed, knocked down and out. And as soon as that happens and the shepherd has gone, the sheep scattered. I've been a shepherd. That was my first job on the farm when I was 16. My actual first job was sewing lambs' eyelids open, because lambs are often born blind with dropped eyelids, and you have to take a needle and thread and sew the eyelid to the eyebrow, and that opens their eyes. And after a bit the thread rots and drops away and the lamb can see. And without any warning, the senior shepherd just said, you can do this lot. And I was left with a needle and thread and was with a shaky hand sewing lambs' eyelids open. And yet I thought, I'm giving them sight. I was learning to be a shepherd and to look after them. My best friend was a sheepdog. And even after I came into the ministry, I had a sheepdog for 13 years. I couldn't bear to be part of it. They're such lovely, intelligent, friendly creatures. I love being a shepherd. But if anything happens to the shepherd, the sheep are lost. And in this case, the shepherd is struck down dead and the sheep scatter. So we have to ask, who is the shepherd and who are the sheep? Simple questions. Well, we know who the shepherd is. We know King David was a shepherd. We know that the priests of Israel were regarded as shepherds, but most of them were bad shepherds. But there was one who came and said, I'm the good shepherd. And there is no doubt about it that this shepherd who was struck dead is Jesus himself, because he quoted it, this very verse, on the night before he died. He was still with his disciples, and he said, you'll all run away and leave me alone. And Peter said, they will, but I won't. And Jesus said, Peter, you'll deny me 3 times before cock crows tomorrow morning. And he did. And so the first application is not only to Jesus as the shepherd, but to the 12 disciples, who literally were scattered when the shepherd was struck. But it means more than that, because he was the good shepherd of Israel. He'd been sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and now they've killed him. Indeed, the verse implies that he was killed by the sheep he came to save. Did you notice a very interesting thing? God brought the sword against the shepherd. God is speaking here. And he said, awake, O sword, against my shepherd. And then defines the shepherd as the man who is close to me. And that phrase, close to me, means my equal, alongside me, my peer. And here's God saying, this shepherd is a man who is my equal. It can only mean our Lord Jesus Christ. And after his death, Israel was scattered. AD 70, they were turned out of Jerusalem. Subsequently, they're scattered to the 4 corners of the earth. And we turn to the second part of this poem. The result was a terrible toll on the sheep. Do you know that in AD 70, when Jerusalem was besieged by Titus, 1 million Jews died in that siege? The believing Jews in Jesus didn't die. They escaped before the worst happened, and they went across the Jordan to Pella, because they remembered Jesus' words, when you see Jerusalem besieged, don't even pack, don't wait, get out. And the believing Jews, remembering Jesus' words, got out and were safe. But 1 million Jews didn't believe in Jesus and were killed. Later in the AD 135, when the Bar Kokhba revolt took place, a second attempt to throw off the Romans, 185,000 Jews were killed. But, as the verse says, a third will be left in the land. And one thing that many Christian Zionists don't realize is that there have been Jews in the Holy Land for 2,000 years. They were turned out of Jerusalem and all committed suicide on Masada. But there were Jews living in Jamnia, just down the mountain, where now the Ben Gurion Airport is sited. And there were Jews way up north in Safed, the city set on a hill, which you can see from anywhere in Galilee. And Jews stayed there. And as soon as they could get back into Jerusalem, they went back into Jerusalem. The idea that all the Jews have been out of the land is not true. Many managed to stay in the land permanently. More recently, of course, many more Jews have come back from the dispersion or diaspora, as they call it, and come back to the land. But only half the Jews have come back. Let's not say Israel is back in the land. There is a state of Israel there, but only half the Jews in the world are there. There's still an awful lot in America who haven't come back. There are a lot in England who haven't come back. And look, they've only got a quarter of the land God promised them. So it's not complete by a long, long way yet. There are more to come, and there's more land to be given to them. But at least a good proportion has already happened. I just say this because we tend to be a little exaggerated when we say all the Jews were turned out, which they weren't, and that all Israel has come back to the land, which they haven't, and they've got all the land back, which they haven't. Let's be realistic and face facts. Well, now, a third of them will survive here, but 2/3 will be lost. Do you know that in the last 800 years, here's a statistic for you. Sorry, that's a horrible word, isn't it? An ancestor of mine invented it, Sir John Sinclair. Statistics. He must have had his own teeth when he said it, but here are some statistics. In the last 800 years, half of all the Jews born have been murdered. The last 800 years. In the last 80 years, 1/3 of all the Jews born in the world have been murdered. I'm afraid this verse came true. 2/3 will perish, be struck down like the shepherd was. 2/3. And when you check out the history of Israel for the last 2,000 years, that verse was spot on. Sobering. So let's come to the third part, which I've called a restored relationship, because this is a lovely part. And it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to. There's mention of a fire first. A fire can do two things. If it's cheap material, a fire burns it up. If it's precious metal, the fire makes it purer. It refines it. So a fire can do two things. And God here says he will send a fire to his people that will refine them. A final purification by fire. It's a strong metaphor. And it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to. And the result of that refining of the people of Israel will be a restored relationship between the sheep and the shepherd. And we have this lovely dialogue between them. God says, they will call and I will answer. There's your spirit of supplication coming in. See how the context begins to shed light. They will call, I will answer. I will say, these are my people. And they will say, this is our God. But it hasn't happened yet. They haven't been through the fire yet. And one of the things I must tell you tonight is that Israel's suffering is far from over. But I'm afraid we've got so almost brainwashed by the text, comfort ye my people, that very few, even Christian Zionists, are willing to tell Israel the truth, that their suffering lies ahead. Not in the diaspora, but this time in their own land. And that's the bad news in Zechariah 12-14. There's good news to follow, but tonight we're looking at the bad news. So here we have in this little poem of 3 verses, 3 phases of Israel's existence over the past 2,000 years plus. 2 of those phases are past. 1 is yet to come. So what is this fire that's going to come? And the answer lies in the rest of chapters 12-14. And we're going to look now at the program of that fire and the restored relationship that will follow. Bits and pieces like a jigsaw, yes. But now we have 10 phases of Jerusalem in just one day. And the phrase that really hits you when you read these 3 chapters, and by the way, I hope you'll all read them tonight or early tomorrow morning before you come to tomorrow night, so you're familiar with it. Because it's not the most familiar part of Scripture to many Christians. Well, now, let's ask 3 introductory questions. When, where, and who? And these 3 questions will open up the 10 phases of Jerusalem which we'll study. When? We're told exactly when. 15 times in these 3 chapters it says, on that day. And that's a phrase that only occurred once in the previous 11 chapters. Now it's on every page, on that day. I hope you scribble on your Bibles. I'm afraid I'm a terror. I use colored crayons. And when I see a phrase repeated, one of the colors picks out that phrase. And there it is, on that day, on that day, on that day, 15 times. So we know it's on a day. Secondly, it is defined as Day of the Lord. Day of the Lord. Now that day hasn't come yet. It will. A day when God intervenes in history again and takes over directly. At the moment, history is in the hands of Satan by God's permission. He is the prince of this world, the God of this world, the ruler of this world. One day God's going to take it back. All of it. Or to put it biblically, the kingdom of God's going to come and be established on this old world. Can't wait. But there's a third clue about this day. It's that day. It's the day of the Lord. And it's a most unusual day because it's not a 24-hour day. In fact, it seems to go on quite a long time. The number of things that are to happen on that day couldn't possibly happen in 24 hours. And so we're told this is a most unusual day. It's a day without frost or darkness or cold. That's what happens when the dark comes down in the Middle East. It's a day when at evening time there will be light. Now that has happened once before in the Bible. Joshua, do you remember his long day? Well, here we have a very prolonged day. You see, the word day in Hebrew, it's the word yom. It's a flexible word. If I said to you, the day of the horse and carriage is over, I'm not referring to 24 hours, am I? You know that. That's a day that's over. It's gone. We're now in the day of the horsepower carriage, the automobile or the car. But the day of the car will someday be over, and it looks like getting much nearer with the price of petrol. But you see how I'm using the word day. I'm using it very flexibly. And the day of the Lord is such a day. It's a long day, a prolonged day, a day in which there will be a lot to do for God to do. And he's going to do it. And the rest of chapters 12 to 14 describe what God will do during that long day. Secondly, where? Well, we're told exactly where all this is going to happen. It will happen first in Jerusalem. 18 times in this section, Jerusalem is mentioned. It's the city of God. It's the focus of God's purpose on earth. And it will be the final focus of history. But there's more than Jerusalem. There's Judah. And these two are mentioned frequently here. Judah is mentioned 5 times. It's not quite the most important, but it's the environment around Jerusalem. That's going to be affected too. So it's the city of God and its environment, which is where the tribe of Judah lived. So we know where all this is going to happen. And we know who it's going to happen to. Because there's a phrase that keeps coming, the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And that double phrase comes 3 times. And so we know who is going to be affected in this day of the Lord. And so we've answered the questions, when will this happen? On the day of the Lord, when he takes control. Where will it happen? In Jerusalem and its immediate environs. Who will it affect? By the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Now we're ready to look at the 10 phases of what's going to happen to that city and to those people at that time. And the first thing we've got to say, and forgive all my alliteration, but it helps me to remember, the city is going to be ringed by a besieging army. And it will be an international army, a United Nations army. Now that would have seemed incredible even 50 years ago. Now it seems entirely credible, because the United Nations as a body is against Israel. The majority of resolutions they've been passing in the United Nations have all been about Israel. And United Nations is now dominated by nations against Israel, and many of them sworn to obliterate Israel, so that in a sense the United Nations is becoming the enemy of Israel. And I can easily envisage a day when a United Nations force is sent against Jerusalem. Can't you envisage that? I certainly can. It will be a united army. Now let's just talk for a moment about the topography of Jerusalem. The biggest surprise I got when I first went in 1961 was that Jerusalem is not on the top of the hills. Did you get that surprise, some of you? It's down in a hollow. And you don't see it until you come up over the hill and look down on it. That was a surprise. I always imagined this great city on the top of a mountain that everybody went up to. And then I realized they go down to it after they've gone up into the hills. It's a ring of mountains all around Jerusalem. Somebody said it's like a nightlight in a saucer. That's quite a vivid description. But there it is, down in the hollow. It's still a very defendable city because there are deep valleys all around it. In fact, I'll tell you something. There were 3 valleys around Jerusalem, and these valleys are in the shape of a big W. There's the Kidron Valley on the east, the Tyropoeon Valley, where the main Roman road went through, but is now filled up with rubbish and destroyed buildings, so it looks level, but it's really quite deep. And then there's the Hinnom Valley, which goes round the bottom and up the west side. Did you know that the word W, the letter W in Hebrew, Shen, is the letter they use for the name of God. And there is the city where God set his name. Isn't that interesting? Now, the old city of Jerusalem was between the middle valley and the eastern valley of Kidron. That's where the city of God was in King David's day. And it was very well defended by these deep valleys around it. It was a bit like, have you ever lifted up a horse's hoof and looked at it? A bit like that. There was the shoe round and then this tongue with hollows in between. It's a most unusual shape of land. You know that there's an octagonal Muslim mosque of the Dome of the Rock on the mount. Every one of those 8 sides of the Dome of the Rock faces a hill around Jerusalem. It's ringed with 8 hills. And you can name some of them: Olivet, Scopus. Very interesting. Jerusalem was not defended on the north side, not easily defended, because that was where the tongue of land met up with the higher land. And Mount Scopus is the northeast from the city. Every invading army made for Mount Scopus. Scopus means view. Telescopus. Microscopus is to see something. And from Mount Scopus you look down on the tongue of land. And there's no valley between Scopus and the city of Jerusalem. There was nothing on that side except the temple of God. So God had to protect them from the north. All this makes Jerusalem one of the most fascinating cities of all. It has been besieged 17 times in its history. No other city has suffered so much, and yet it was called the city of peace. Salem was its first name, or Shalom. And this city of peace has been besieged by enemy forces 17 times. And it's so easy to besiege because you just need to put the enemy on the hills around it and stop all food going in, stop all transport and commerce. The one thing that makes Jerusalem vulnerable is that it doesn't have a water supply inside the walls. And that makes a city very vulnerable to a siege. There was one spring of water in the Kidron Valley on the east side, just outside the wall. So what they did, first of all, they dug a staircase down inside the rock, which emerged at the spring. And they could creep down with buckets and fill them up with water and carry them back up. And it was through that staircase that King David conquered the city and got inside. Hezekiah later dug a tunnel for about 1/3 of a mile, winding through the rock. I walked through that on my first visit, and the water was up to here, and the ceiling is just above your head. I tell you, I didn't want to do it again. And the man in front of me from our church had a torch, and he was holding this torch to point the way ahead, and the naughty man pretended that it suddenly went deep, and he bent his knees and his head went under water, and we just saw the torch going along above the water. I tell you, he put the wind of us. Now, of course, now they've lowered the water to about your knee level or lower, so you can just paddle through. You come out in the pool of Siloam. And so Hezekiah's tunnel brought the water from the Kidron spring right into the city and saved it in a big square pool. I'm afraid my naughty mind enjoyed something there too. As you come out of the tunnel, they don't tell you that the floor of the tunnel goes out underwater about 3 feet and then just drops. And you can't see it through the water. And people were so glad to get out of the tunnel that they were rushing ahead and disappearing under the water. It was hilarious. We just sat and watched. But all this made Jerusalem very vulnerable to a siege. And you can see why they built the staircase and the tunnel to get the water inside the town. Now here we have an international army from all the nations of the earth, a United Nations force, besieging the city. That has never happened yet, but I'm afraid it will. This is one of the unfulfilled prophecies. Jerusalem will suffer a final siege. However, God from the beginning announces the outcome of that siege. He said he will make Jerusalem an intoxicating cup, so that enemy force will reel as if they're drunk or drugged. I'll say more about that tomorrow night. He also said, I will make Jerusalem an immovable rock, and any who try to move it will injure themselves. Imagine a great big rock that some people are trying to shift, and all they do is rupture themselves or bruise themselves or break bones, whatever. That's what God says is the final outcome of this siege. But I'm afraid it's going to go a long way first. And this is probably the big surprise. 2 things to notice before we come to that surprise. Number 1, it is God who has gathered the United Nations force. God has brought them there. Mind you, he hasn't brought them against their will. They're willing to come. God never forces people against their will. He cooperates with their will and what they want to do. That's God. If they want to harden their hearts, like Pharaoh, God will help them to harden them. Pharaoh hardened his heart 7 times, and then 3 times God hardened it for him. God says, if you choose that, I'll help you. And so this United Nations force has probably got so fed up with Israel that they send a force against Jerusalem to bring peace to the Middle East, because peace in the Middle East is peace for the whole world. War in the Middle East is war for the whole world, because all of us are dependent on oil, which comes from the Middle East, which is why dear Golda Meir said, what was Moses thinking of to lead us all the way through the Middle East to the only country that didn't have any oil? But do you know they've found the oil now? Offshore, just off Haifa, they found first immeasurable stores of natural gas. And with the natural gas, they found below it how many million barrels of oil, I don't know. They are already planning for Israel to export oil. Can you imagine that? My son and my son-in-law and daughter have an oil exploring firm. They employ people both sides of the Atlantic to find oil. And they train explorers for BP and Shell and other big oil companies. They started up their own business. My daughter has a real nose for oil. She's so found oil in the North Sea that there's an oil rig called Angie after her. You look it up on the map of the oil rigs. And so they know all about this. And so my son-in-law has talked to me about the incredible find. And you know, it was Christians who believed all along there was oil. Oil at the foot of, what's the tribe? Asher. Oil at the foot of Asher. And it's just off the coast of the foot of Asher. Exactly where Christians found it. And in fact, the son of the man who first wrote the book, pointing to the foot of Asher as having oil, is now my distributor of my teaching in America. And he's given me a copy of his father's old book that first said that's where they'll find oil. So I rejoice for Israel in becoming oil sufficient, or at least energy sufficient, not too far ahead in the future. The other thing to notice is that God has drawn the United Nations force together to destroy it. They wanted to come and settle Jerusalem, and God has drawn them. And God is going to destroy, obliterate that United Nations army. That's why he's called them. He's called them for judgment in the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is the Kidron Valley on the east side of Jerusalem. God knows what he's doing. However, we now come to the surprise, and it's a shock almost. You see, there are two pieces, one in chapter 12 and one in chapter 14, which belong together. And when you put them together, they fit. And chapter 14 tells us that the enemy besieging army will get right into the capital and will capture the whole city. Now, this is a shock. If you tell the Jews this, it will be an awful shock to them. Because the one place they feel safe is in their own country. And this is going to happen not only in their own country, but in the capital of it. It's bad news for Israel, this. Because they not only capture the city, but the men of the city will watch their wives being raped, will watch their property being ransacked and looted, and themselves will be deported. It says in chapter 14, verse 2, that half of the city will have to go into exile. Now this is Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. And this is happening in their own land, to which so many Jews have come thinking we'll be safe in our own land. And we have to ask the question, why does God let them in? Why doesn't God deal with them as he dealt with them when there were over 100,000 Assyrians besieging the old Jerusalem? And God killed a lot of them with a disease. And they have found piles of skeletons outside the old city walls of Jerusalem and presume they're the Assyrians. God stopped the Assyrian besiegers outside the walls. But here, he's let them right in. Quite frankly, we are reading about the fire that will be the final refinement of the people of Israel. It's God's last discipline of his people. Because even the Holocaust didn't do it. It didn't turn the nation to supplicate God. In fact, it turned more Jews to curse God and turn against him and say, I'm not going to believe in God anymore. I've talked to some of the Holocaust victims, and many of them are so bitter about God. Where was he when we were suffering like that? God has one last card to play, may I put it that way, and it is to let the city of Jerusalem succumb to the enemy. I don't say that lightly. I feel for them. But God said it, and it's going to happen. Because everything else he said will happen. So the place will be ravaged. Indeed, other prophets prophesied that God's furnace would come to Jerusalem. furnace, fire, same thing. But it's their last discipline. And we know from the rest of the section in Zechariah that it will work and that they will cry to God because no one else can help them. This is a United Nations force. They've no nation to appeal to. I'm afraid it means that America will join in. So who can they appeal to? There's only one place and person they can. God, help us. They will call on me and I will answer them. And I will say, these are my people. This is the apple of my eye. And you're touching him. And I will slam down and deal with you. But I'm letting it go this far for their sake, so that they will call on me and cry to me, so that there's hope in this awful situation. I think to some of the men in Jerusalem, they'll feel the Holocaust is happening all over again. And happening not in Germany, but in Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. And we need to pray for them. That they will cry to God in desperation. And God will answer. I'm going to finish there tonight. It's a sobering note to finish on, I agree. But nevertheless, that's the bad news. And tomorrow night, I'll give you the good news. There are 8 further phases in Jerusalem's life. This second phase, when the city is ravaged, is the lowest of them all. From now on, Jerusalem will be on the up and up, and will be exalted among the mountains. So come back tomorrow night, and we'll look at the rest of the story.